important part in that aspect is that we may not have the capacity or the language of expressing the encounter. We just may not have the vocabulary or perceptual capacity to articulate. It's something that I work with experts in the intuitive professional knowing. And some of it is pre-verbal, which means once they're doing their job, they actually know what to do, but they cannot articulate it why. So if I work with a surgeon who is an expert, for example, in heart surgery, and there will be another expert literally working just across the wall, and they would be doing similar procedures, but they would assume that the other surgeon does exactly the same thing, and they're performing similar approaches, but in fact, they will do things differently and think it's obvious to another expert. So they'll work side by side, but would never, ever share that expertise. And in fact, they would think that everybody should know that. So this is when the professionals become experts, but they don't know what they're experts in because they think it's obvious. So that's what we're dealing with, is where that we have this experience, but we are unable to articulate it because we don't have the language or we don't have the tools on how to transfer that knowledge or expertise. And as you know, the experience is very personal, and often you sit with somebody and you have just no way to translate what you have been through. And you really want to empathize to a degree that you can help the person, but there's nothing you can do. It's just so different and out of our range of experience.
Perhaps humanity has yet to develop the necessary tools to truly process and communicate experiences with UAP and NHI, non-human intelligence. If these experiences exist beyond the limit of human perception and language, how can others relate, empathize, and create a space of understanding? When the words don't exist and the event defines comprehension, how do we bridge that gap? Learning and believing are crucial first steps, but how do we move beyond them? What new forms of communication, interpretation, or even cultural evolution might be needed to truly engage with this phenomenon? Iya Whiteley PH.D. is a clinical psychologist and cognitive and human factors engineer. She's dedicated her career to understanding how pilots and astronauts process information rapidly in high-stress environments, ultimately aiming to enhance situational awareness for improved safety in aviation. Join us as we get rebelliously curious. Iya, thank you so much for joining me on Rebelliously Curious today. I met you in 2023 at the first Soul conference ever in San Francisco. It was an amazing conference with such a diverse group of academics talking about politics, speaking about looking at diversity, speaking about from your side, a clinical aspect of the UAP whole phenomenon, along with then kind of like the psychology behind it. And that's exactly where you fit in. Your talk was really interesting because you had this narrow focus for how astronauts and pilots have dealt with the feelings or the experiences of potentially UAP, but mainly being in space, and how that has fundamentally changed the way that they see their life and themselves within society and the planet in general. So first of all, I would like to say thank you for joining me today, and I'm really looking forward to having our chat.
Thank you. Yes, delighted. And it was good. Thank you for approaching, me just to say that you would like to talk and dive deeper. I always welcome that opportunity. So thank you. Yes. And the questions from you, makes the conversation different. So that's wonderful when we can converse.
How did you find yourself in this line of work? How did you find yourself getting involved with the psychology, working with astronauts and pilots with, on planet and also in space? How did you find yourself there?
I love diving into our capacity, our potential, our capability. I was interested why do we expand beyond what we think we're capable of, and why in the extreme environment some new capabilities arise in us, or something that we had not previously thought we are capable of, or we thought we will respond it in this way and we have differently. And I also wanted to know, how do we prepare? Can we prepare to be a certain way in an extreme environment or in an unusual environment for us? And I was looking for the field that would study that. And at the time, there wasn't a field that would do that, if it makes sense. So I slowly pursued past clinical psychology qualification and the foundation that gave me an opportunity both know, what the spectra we could have in terms of what kind of challenges, I guess, that we could have, but also on every spectrum. Let's say, if you think of depression, for example, and anxiety, it is a scale. So we are all on different parts of the scale at any one time. So every one of us is somewhere on the depression scale, and every one of us has an anxiety scale. It's just that we are, let's say, navigating that in different phases of life. And where it feels like we are, let's say, very anxious, but it might appear or might feel, but we know exactly how to react. So it's then no longer, if you wish, a disorder or something that we cannot address, which is quite interesting. So that at what point is it, on the clinical scale, and at what point it's actually a normal state that then evolves into something that we actually outperform ourselves. And so from that point, I was able to dive into research aspects and the best population that I thought would be pilots. And the reason why to work with pilots who are, because they're in the environment that you cannot pause, or surgeons, for example, you cannot put a surgery on pause. You cannot pause the plane. You have to, you're in this dynamic transition. And as circumstances arise, you just have to, from that moment, use all the resource that you have and then, take to the next step. And I was interested, where does this, particularly intuition, where does this arise, that they would have a good outcome, because they had many options. And there could have been many, let's say, positive outcomes, but yet they take that one. Or something changes and something escapes our attention, or something we call situational awareness. And the person suddenly, it's like a bubble, described as a bubble that we are in, and it's continuously renewed. And it's a bubble because it's got a time parameter. So we have past and future in front of us, and and certain situations arise. And sometimes what I found is that people would reconstruct the past in order to fit their story, but in reality there was something different. And I was interested because it's not a lie, but it's depending who's listening. Because if I'm speaking with a colleague psychologist, I would use a certain terminology, but I will also, let's say, have to preserve a particular status, particular knowledge base, and statue, for example, or it's a colleague and a friend, and then I could be say, well, like, look, I had no idea what to do. What would you do in that case? And that slight change completely changes the storyline, and it doesn't mean that you said something wrong, but you're reconstructing, so you're on the same level, able to weave the story together. And so I wanted to know, how can we dive into the thought process of a person as it happened, not as it's constructed by the listener, but to get to the point almost where I can read people's thoughts. Which, some people apparently can do in
Apparently
reality.
so. If you listen to the telepathy tapes.
Yes. And so, but at the time I was in Australia, and there was a family or couple, Jim McLennan and Mary Omedy, and they were studying something called naturalistic decision making. And they were doing this with firefighters who were fighting natural bushfires. It's prevalent in Australia and, as we know, in California as well. And some firemen were more effective and knew when to walk out, either from the bushfire or from the burning house or structure. And that split second of that decision of knowing what to do and when to leave, because every second counts in lives. So whether they can reach or not reach, or if they go, they might lose that person and the crew, let's say, for example. Or if they go and, save one person but not the other, just because that's the best they could do, and then they walk out and the structure collapses. So how do they know that? They did not travel in time. And the same I've observed, with people in other professions, such as surgeons, such as pilots, astronauts. And so they've developed this method that allows for a person, without an external viewer, such as there is no judgment eye, that then allows the story to flow, as it were. And that was fascinating, because somehow people who'd never talked or did not know how to explain their experience, they would be able to just almost dive and almost be present and as if reliving the whole process again, not with hypnosis, but fully present. And then you could hear their thoughts and also understand where these decisions come from. And what was fascinating is that they were not coming in the way that classical psychology at the time that I learned in textbooks was happening. They didn't have a hierarchy of decision making. They did not have, consequences and analysis performed. They just knew instantly that that was the right thing, but they could not articulate it. But what happened in the process of reviewing this in a new way without observer, and we know now in quantum physics, right, that the observer changes how the particles behave. So, and what happened here is that they themselves did not realize they had the expertise. So they did not understand what cues they were picking up until they walked through that process. And we do have this knowledge base, which is, it's called pre-verbal. So it's something that we kind of feel and know, but we are not ready to put it into words. And we have been in those situations, like you feel speechless, but also you have so much processing going on, but you cannot articulate it for some reason. But equally for this UAP phenomena, we equally don't have the language. So we're not versed in explaining what is actually happening with people who are having these experiences, either because it's not allowed to speak with those terms, which is one, such as that you're not allowed to talk about feelings, for example, if you're working in extreme environments. And, the recent Jacob Barber speaking, and that was beautiful because that allowed for other people to recognize themselves that they couldn't articulate it, but now they have a window or they have a door that is opened, and they have this opportunity to say, oh, actually, that was, something so close to what I have experienced. And all those people have permission. Once one of us shares something, it allows for that, to unravel, to open. And the same happened with these firefighters, is that once they start sharing, the other person started to recognize, yes, but I've also noticed this. And suddenly there's this exchange, which was, we were not able to train, let's say, firefighters, or we were not able to train pilots and astronauts and surgeons. And I had that with surgeons. There was one particular surgeon who was very successful with, actually, he was an anesthesiologist, and he was using an old method of doing epidural, which is they go into the space that is not even defined, such as that there's no path. And they explain it to you. You go through this layer, then that layer, and you cannot see it. You have to feel it. And you can't feel it as the surgeon, well, as the anesthesiologist is doing, until you, the student or who is learning, do it yourself. And you can't simulate this in artificial tissue. But there are simulators, how to do it, but it's not quite. And so they're going to the space and they have to create the space between kind of an empty space and then expand that space. So they're creating a new kind of substance, if you wish, or a new property that doesn't exist there. And that method was not allowed anymore. I think it was about injecting air, and now they do liquid. But he was so successful that they did not want, that he had like a highest success rate, because it's not always effective, and it's very dangerous also to do that. And when he was asked to train other people, he did not know how, but people thought he was arrogant because he wouldn't share it. He just wanted to keep kind of, I don't know, success rate or something like that. But when we met, because the surgeons opened up and they said, let's see if we can exchange expertise, because what I'm interested in is that how can we exchange this expertise rapidly, so instantaneously, not through, years of training, but even between experts who think they're doing the same thing, but they're not. They're doing the same surgery, but they arrive at decisions in very different manner. And they almost it feels like nourishment when they start talking, to each other in this, new capacity. And so once I used the methodology with the surgeon, he was just like, I couldn't stop, he was just pouring out. And all of his colleagues was like, he was not, trying to be, keeping it to himself. He just did not know how to put it into words. And there was not enough prompt.
Can I stop you there for a second? Because I think everything you're saying is so important in context and just how people communicate with each other, how we don't communicate very well with each other at times. And especially with the UFO topic and the phenomena, we see that there's so many challenges being able to self-express an experience, right? And not being able to have those words to really explain what it felt like or what happened to them, especially when they're seeing something too that they've never seen before, especially if it's been an occupant, allegedly, or even just a craft. Can we go back to some moments that you did talk about in Seoul when you worked with some astronauts, and when they were in space and they came back and had these profound experiences and they couldn't explain what they saw looking back at planet Earth and how it changed everything inside of them. And there wasn't the words, if I'm correct, or correct me if I'm wrong, but there wasn't words to really articulate what that deeply felt inside for them because it was so profound. I would imagine having a UAP experience could somewhat be similar. It could be extremely profound and immense of loving. It also can be very scary too, right? And I can imagine at times looking back at Earth, those exact feelings would be the same, even scary at times, right? Scared for ourselves and humanity, and just scary in general, right? Realizing how small the Earth really is compared to the universe. So can we step back a little bit and talk about that fundamental process in conjunction with the type of programs that you're working on or the theories that you're working on? And then let's deconstruct it a little bit more, but going back to that feeling that those astronauts initially had.
These are profound for people who share, and they usually share it in very intimate setting, because it's almost, and I found that people who have this profound effect from whatever event that happened, it could be, in space, or it could be, a birth of a child, or passing of a loved one, or something that really changed their worldview, which is what happens with this overview effect. When astronauts travel into space and their conceptual framework has to reconstruct. And there's an entire book published, which is called The Planet, And it's A3 format. It's quite big, and it's got pictures from cosmonauts and astronauts. It's, I think, in 1980s it was published, and a very limited edition. And every image has a quote of what the person willing to kind of to share. And you can see that how carefully the words were chosen, because that entire book was communicated with every person who contributed, and it was across borders, across space agencies. And there were European, US, I believe there was a Japanese astronaut as well in that particular book. But when you read it, you understand that reverence, that there is a space between words, which is more important because they couldn't insert a word to describe it. And what is also interesting, and I guess you can see that with people, if you know them before and after, you can see their actions or reactions, or how they deal with other people and the things that they have dealt with before. They have a different eye to it, or different sight, or different intonation, or respect. But more so, from just speaking with them, they're almost waiting for you to ask the question, because it's sometimes, if the person is not ready to hear, it's almost pointless sharing. And almost like it felt to me when it was asked with not a kind of a genuine, I want to dive in with you to that experience, but rather there was another feeling. I'm just trying to think. So that intent in the question had the quality of the response. So we, and this is quite important for what's happening in the UAP field as well right now, and we're evolving beautifully, is that our public response on what people say, and we say, let's say some of us, it's not possible, I want to see the metal, or it's not possible, I want to see, a living being, or something like that. Otherwise, it's not true. And it's almost like discredits and doesn't allow for other people to share, because they did not have a physical experience, but it was profound, and they cannot put it into words. But as I mentioned before, that sharing allows for another experience to be shared. So it's almost like, if I don't share it with you, it will not touch you in that space, or recollecting another experience. And
do you think then it might be from a conscious connection then, when we decide, because sharing is so important, because it does, right, gives the space for others to be able to share their experiences. So it adds to a collective understanding. And by at least sharing, because maybe we're not able, you would hope that sometimes sharing would transcend and give a form of empathy, of understanding, so people could almost feel what it's like to have that experience, and be able to almost embody it, right? If they can picture it or visualize it or see it, so they can understand how profound it technically be, with maybe without being there. But giving the ability to share does open up this conscious connection for us to be able to connect with each other, maybe through that little space, through sharing, because that is all we have if we don't have words, or we don't have the ability to really express those profound experiences.
Yes, this sharing allows us to put our experience into words, or find words, similarities on how the other person expressing it. And something you have touched just now about
what I think one of the points is, maybe what I'm trying to get to as well, is that through us sharing, we consciously connect with each other,
yes,
where we're putting things into the universe and putting it in the environments around us, so that it's subconsciously sitting there, And so maybe we're not able to tap it, but we know that it's in our mind, it's in our brain, it's in our subconscious kind of floating around. And so more that we hear these stories and, we might not have to see all this evidence, but we hear all these profound stories, which is technically a form of evidence. Let's be honest, testimony it's extremely important. So when we have it baked in the back of our subconscious and it's consistently playing within our main forefront of our main culture. It's not just kind of sitting in a subculture where we're like, no, it's actually sitting in our main subculture where we're seeing it every day on the news and social media and people are talking about it and it's becoming more accessible that taking it from your subconscious, we're moving it into our conscious that creates a form of connection and understanding where we're able to move forward as a society and as a group of people.
Yes, exactly. You've just, formed it beautifully because we are co-creating in a way. And by speaking to each other, we allow the possibility of it to exist. And we can dive deeper into the consciousness and sort of more traditions that are more grounded or haven't forgotten their roots on how they think about consciousness. And in our kind of Western approach, as a viewer and as a processor, we don't want our experience to be tarnished. So in a way, often the person who have the experience that has landed them and kind of reformed their concept, they have this almost quiet knowing that once it have experienced it, they don't need to prove it to anyone or to discuss it with anyone, because for one, there's nothing to debate is so true. And then that's why sharing does not happen or only happens when they feel the resonance with another person. And to me, it feels like the more we are able for experiences to be the way they are, the way the person experienced it, like Diana Pasulka, looking at these texts that are historic, written by people who experienced it and they were redacted. And then when we are reading them in the light, written by that pen or that person, we can actually then transmit it to our experience, how they couldn't put it into words, but they were trying to reframe it in their reality then. And then if we read it now, and then we could think that we are putting concepts or assigning meaning to it that is meaningful to us now, but in the same way it was meaningful then. Let's say, fire, let's say, was equivalent to how we would describe, technology or electricity or light source or, white fire, but what is white fire? And that's quite interesting. Actually, the fire in space and microgravity behaves very differently, and it's actually quite blue and circular because the way the particles are dissipating is different. And so the key component to that is that people who had deeply profound change in them, they have no need to prove anything. But people who are trying to prove something, they're still establishing or reframing their framework, and they're looking where is that ground for them. And people who have that experience, they don't need to engage in that conversation. So what we're having people who are engaging, who are looking to establish their framework. But those who have established their framework, they remain on the surface until they're invited by people who feel no need to prove anything, but just genuinely saying, well, this is what happened. And then when they're questioned, is that real? They don't need to prove it. Is it real? It's almost like there is this.
It almost has this like a different form of self-awareness, because I think when you I think we're always trying to be self-aware. Well, I hope most people are, consistently every day. We're always learning, evolving, and I don't think you can be 100% self-aware, right? I don't think that actually exists, but you can get better and better at being self-aware with your actions and your daily thoughts. But I think when you have like such a profound experience, your self-awareness must, like, I ask you as a clinical psychologist, your self-awareness must just kind of do a 360 instantly, especially if you didn't have a lot before, maybe. And then you move into a place where you go, oh my gosh, I've had this profound experience. For sure you ask, what does it mean to me and to others? And people probably ask, why me a lot? But your self-perception has to take a real 360 instantly. Can you give an example maybe of even pilots or astronauts that you've worked with and that maybe have seen UAP or not, or even just been in space and have and explain maybe that framework of how their mind shifted and their self-perception shifted so much after something so unbelievably unbelievable of an experience or something so really profound for them?
So we definitely, it's almost like there is this pause of contemplation after that experience, and because we're still processing, and there is this element of people forgetting as well. So people, and this phenomena of forgetting exists. It's natural, because if we cannot articulate it or we're not ready to accept it, it's almost like it's erased. So you could ask people who were in the same group, and they would see different things, and they would frame it in the conceptual framework that is they're able to accept it or process it. And there are famous examples of husband and wife, one seeing an angel and another one seeing a technical or technology in front of them, describing exactly the same event, being present in the same room. And, we could think conceptually that, this can shapeshift, for example. That could be one explanation. But actually, what if it is framed by us, not by what is presented in front of us? And other experiences is where people would be in the same group and some would completely forget, like as if it never happened, because it would just break their foundation, the one that they're standing on, and they're just not ready for that. And it may arise later in their life. And we know this, people with traumatic experiences that, personal experience, nothing to do with UAP, that they would just take it out of their life as if it never happened, as if it was not their life. And then there would be a time when it will surface and they could then go back to it, and that will be helpful rather than forcing for that to arise kind of on purpose. So some of the UAP experience or the phenomena that is related to UAP is that some people then by someone's story get awakened to their experience, which they couldn't frame it, but then through hearing somebody's story they remember. And it's almost like, and then the person might start doubting to say, well, did I imagine it, or did I wish for it to happen to me, or something like that? So some people can doubt that again, and they would want hypnosis, or they would want a way, they want almost like a proof, in order for it to reconstruct their foundation and concept. But what I find it fascinating is that our conceptual, or our what we believe can and can't happen, frames what we see, and that's an absolute reality at the moment. And UAP is a beautiful example of that.
Well, I think the perception part is so interesting because you hear that people have similar experiences, but their perceptions are so different in how they perceive the experience. I really love things about neurodiversity. I'm neurodivergent myself. A lot of my friends are, a lot of people in my community are. And, it's such a buzzword now. And I'm so it makes me so happy to hear that because it was never like that when I was growing up. No one ever really talked about it. So now it's important that we understand that people think differently. We don't think the same as each other, right? And we don't process information the same way as everyone else does. So, for example, having a UAP experience, if I was neurodivergent, I might experience something different than someone is, I hate saying the word normal typical, but maybe closer on that scale of being normal typical, because I think we're all on a spectrum, to be honest. But there's something called synesthesia that you speak about in your lecture at Seoul. And I actually have met somebody that has synesthesia that's an amazing artist, musical artist. When she talks or sees people or when she listens to music, she sees it in colors. And I remember she looked at me and she said, and we were sitting with someone who worked at Universal Music Canada and we were having a meeting. And she said to me, when I look at you, I see green. And then when she looked at Sean, she's like, I see blue. And I was like, that's so interesting. And so I said to her, I'm like, are you seeing my aura or like, what are you seeing? And she's like, I don't know. I just see this color. And so I think that going back to our perception with being, having synesthesia, which is part of a neurodiversity, her perception in the world is so different. And the way that synesthesia is accessible into all of us, and we don't have the ability anymore for some of us to use it because it hasn't become important because we live in cities. It's a sense that we have decided to dumb down. How does, in your perception, how does something like synesthesia or neurodiversity really change our perception of the phenomenon and how we view it and how people that are neurodivergent view it?
Yes, and this is exactly it. So through these, so synesthesia was not considered to be true, and
oh, I didn't know that. They didn't consider it to be
it's
true.
very recent.
That's
So,
wild.
yes,
That's so
because
crazy. Yeah.
exactly. So how could you see a person? You don't look green. Or the Sean doesn't look blue to me. So obviously something is wrong. It's about our conceptual framework. So we either ready to accept something new, or we are keeping the within what we feel comfortable or acceptable. And there are all sorts of reasons of why that happens, right? There could be that it's convenient. It could be that I can't accept an alternative. And nobody said that before me, and I respect and I stand on the shoulders of giants. If I say that, how would I look? And all of this spectra that is societal. And yet when we go to traditions, the people have, still more connected, let's say, to their roots, family, and the ground. And they accept the person to flourish the way they are. And they even given names by what capabilities or abilities they express. And they would have several names, and they might have a name change during a particular rite of passage because they will start having a certain ability. So synesthesia until 70s, I believe, 1970s, was not accepted as a true condition. Just like Diana Hennessy Powell, that from the telepathy tapes, who is a psychiatrist and was told that, studying these people who are savants, so people who have these extraordinary abilities like amazing memory, or they're able to calculate very extraordinary numbers, so they know languages and they have never studied them. So the assumption is that they've learned somewhere that language, because I cannot accept another possibilities. So then, I surely think that, they've watched some tapes. I don't know, watched somewhere. They've picked it up. They use a dictionary. But because my conceptual framework, for example, doesn't allow me that somebody could just instantly know. And so then I am to be more open and to allow for it to be, and then the explanation will arise. From that investigation, we can then dive in. So if we think of synesthesia, then it was also considered that, it's like people who are strange, let's put it, softly. But then once the person took that as an academic pursuit, which was also shown, frowned upon. They found there are more than 150 pairings of synesthesia, so combinations of, yeah. And
Wow.
if you have one pairing, you're likely to have more. So if you have one that is prominent, you're very likely to have others. We just did not have a vocabulary for it. We did not know it existed. So some people, let's say, will taste it. You will pull, let's say, like a needle through a cooked chicken, and they would know if it's cooked or not. They will actually experience it inside through sensation. And so one person described it in points. It doesn't have enough points, but that's how they felt it. And that's a form of synesthesia. We cannot explain it because we think the senses are only, seeing, hearing, tasting, for example, maybe tactile, but we are wired like neurodiversity, right? There is so many perceptions that we don't describe about temperature, about humidity, just some magnetic perception, electric perception. There are, many, many types that we
Well, we see
actually
that
have.
animals have them too. So
We
why?
do have them too.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Why wouldn't we? Yeah. We see it with cats. We see it with tons of bats.
Yes. So it's very interesting that we would categorize. And so the phenomena of the UAP would be beautiful if we just allow for this collection of experiences to emerge, because then we'd be able to explore or dive deeper of start asking questions how. And that leads us to the next exploration, or maybe sharing this example will allow the person to come through with the same or similar sensation, and then maybe maybe they'll articulate it better, so for us to conceptualize further. So that's why synesthesia, in a way, emerged in the same way. It was unacceptable. You were weird, in one sense, and children were shunned if they would talk about that letters have colors, and let's say in school, and they would be, not talked to either by teachers or peers, and so and then it shapes our life and experience. And the same is happening now. Only hopefully children are able to share their experiences with parents and they're a bit more accepting. But it starts from us, from adults, for allowing for whatever unravel and not apply a concept or judge too soon. So and I see that happening, in the same way, which is really beautiful.
Yeah, and we have this conversation with Barber right now where he speaks about a specific group of people. He talks about people that are gay and that people are left-handed. Like I've never heard this before. And it's not saying that I don't think Barber is right, because who am I to know if that is accurate or not? But it's interesting that he has taken a segment of the population. I think neurodivergent, we have heard that people have had these, able to have these abilities because they're neurodivergent, and there's more, I think more, we would say, evidence to prove that when we're looking at people's brains. Gary Nolan has been one of them doing research in that area. But outside of this now, we kind of take this different direction where we go right into people we're saying that that are gay and left-handed. As a clinical psychologist, when you hear that, what do you think? Okay, this could obviously be a possibility, but why this classification of people, especially during a time that is so politically fueled right now between specifically a certain population, not that are left-handed, but that are gay, especially in North America. So when you hear that, and Barber said that, what did you first initially think when you're hearing this?
Well, I am coming to find out about this through friends, as I'm trying not to engage in the media. But I think it's just a preference in a way, and it's something in our environment, in our development, makes us, choose to do so. I grew up where, left-handed people were, should learn to write with the right hand because that's the proper way. And when we had a student in a class that was left-handed, they're almost like strange. like they're not like everyone. And we would have like one in the class, probably that one persistent child who wanted to express themselves as they are, and they didn't fall, under the pressure. And they just, and they developed into the, beautiful, artistic, creative person. And possibly those who should have been left-handed, right? They were pressed, and they have lost on that neural development that would have wired them in the way that meant to be wired. And I'm fascinated by that, because what I've studied and looked at our development from birth, that looks like by 6 months, our brain starts to prune connections that we're not using. So in a sense, we have this network of capability and ability that is present. And it's almost like we can use this map and explore all dimensions, or we would just, decide to put a highway, only that highway, and that's it. And then when we grow older, we unable, to break that highway in order to kind of explore deeper, more intricate layers, or we have built houses and, to put a new highway through, to learn a new ability, to have more dominant, let's say, I don't know, maybe we wish to learn piano when we are older and never studied music. It will just, we have to then do this kind of loops, because we cannot completely erase what is the foundation. So, and children by 6 months starts to specialize in language. And if they don't hear the sounds, or don't need to imitate certain sounds, then that capability and muscle development and neurons are actually not mapping. So then in the future, they would be unable to produce or even hear that sound. Extraordinary, like
Really?
we're all the same. Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
So that's
It
why
can't be developed later in life. It has to be in the beginning of childhood.
Well, some people are able to acquire it. It takes a long time. And I have friends, from Europe who, let's say, then eventually, leave or needed to speak, for example, Chinese. And it's a very tonal language. And there is a slight difference, and the word is completely different. And the same, some Chinese people, when they come to speak another language, they cannot pronounce the letter, and they cannot pronounce it because they cannot hear it. So because they didn't need that. So they will replace with the sound of how similar it sounds.
That
So
makes a lot of sense. Thank you. You've clarified one question I've always had. Yeah.
yes, so it's quite interesting, but it doesn't mean that. So there's a Professor Suzuki, who is a Japanese, and his family had a factory producing violins, but he actually did not play violin when he was a child, although it was a family business. And then when he, I believe, moved to Europe, he took up the lessons and he learned to play violin, and then noticed that his revelation is that children who have not learned a particular accent or didn't grow up in a particular part of Japan did not acquire that particular tongue or sound or accent. So they would never be able, from his view, they could never imitate or, try to sound like those people from that part of, area in mountains, let's say. And but what he did find is that we are learning by sound. So if we don't start from music, but start from sound and learn the sound first, then the music follows, such as that then we can recognize how the instruments sound and we could start looking for that sound to appear. So, and this is, again, reverse concept in a way, that almost like you have to learn notes, you have to have, musical ear. And what I found is that some adults who follow this Suzuki method, and I was one of those with my children, because you have to listen like hundreds and hundreds of times before you even begin your music lesson. And it also comes from innate wish to copy somebody else, because you hear it and you want to reproduce it in the same way. So the child is listening and watching other children play, and they only, if you wish, permitted or allowed to play when they cannot resist any longer to sit in the background. So then, by listening to that sound, they know exactly what comes next. So they cannot play, in a way, a wrong note because they know how it should sound. So they're not learning mechanically, they're learning by ear. And where I was considered that I cannot, tone deaf in a way that I couldn't speak or imitate the sound after I've actually listened with children, I was able to do that. I just didn't hear it enough. I was not exposed to that. That neural connection was not made. But then through that repetition, you recognize and you're able to do it quite perfectly. So, all these myths, in a way, that you are unable to do it. Maybe you haven't met the right teacher, who accepted how you sound, maybe even that. Very interesting.
It's so interesting because it makes me think of, the first thing that comes to my mind is like historically, we look at other civilizations for the longest periods of time where they were using all of these senses. Like they had synesthesia, they had so many of these abilities that we just don't carry, anymore. Who knows? Maybe more of them were, there's more neurodiversity back then than there was now. I believe I've heard that's more of an evolution neurologically, but who knows? We've had so many of these capabilities. So I think it is not far off of looking at civilizations that potentially might have been able to capture something that's happening as a phenomena around us and being able to see it and interpret it and understand it better than we are today, because it's it's in us innately, but we're not using those abilities consistently. And I think what you're bringing up is such a wonderful point of looking at, how do we educate children? How do we start, at such a young childhood ability to be able to capture what's inside of us that we innately have, and those capable abilities rather than, not using them and really working on them, because that's something that we've lost. And if it isn't for UFO, which I think it would be wonderful, I think it's just better that maybe we do have those in society. So maybe going back to being able to focus on working on that with children at such a young age, maybe would change how we view society when we're older and how we communicate with each other, when for years to come. Maybe we need to reverse that thinking. Yeah.
Yes. So this is fundamental for us as developing a society, is that if we allow a concept to prevail or allow for that to be, for that experience, then for our children, it is already existing. So if we say, look, we are all different, and then that we are allowing for that to happen instead of saying, well, you don't fit in or something, we don't have that category, so means you can't be, but you don't cut the flower if it doesn't look right, or unless you're like a perfect gardener, let's say. But in a way, you don't go around and say, this tree is not accepted, or the way, I don't know, these flowers cross-pollinate or trees cross-pollinate, and there's a new variety of, I don't know, species or something like that that is happening. We're still discovering, new species, especially underwater, that we haven't come across. Yeah, I mean, why are we so deterministic?
Great question. Thank you so much. And I will leave it there. Yeah, it's such a wonderful conversation. I would love to have you back another time when we can discuss more. I think the cognitive behavioral concepts behind UAP and just in general, how we look at society today is so important. And, I do see so many different people within society trying to have these conversations or educate themselves. And I think that's at least where we have to start, because then, hopefully in the next generations to come, we do see a major impact, because it never really happened. I know for my family's generation, they didn't have those resources, and now, we have them and they're accessible for people around the world. So, I think this is just the start of it. So Thank you so much. And I say to all my guests, thank you for being rebelliously curious with me today.
Yes, absolutely. I love it. Rebellious and curious.
Always. Thank
I
you.
appreciate Chrissy for this opportunity. This is wonderful, and I look forward, to this new conversation, sparking each other onto new, curious, and rebellious topics.
Me too. Thank you so much. Let's get it.